Those of you who are new to this session, welcome. This is a session specifically dealing with the development and use of case studies, and in particular, the cybersecurity case studies that we have been developing as part of a National Science Foundation grant. And one of the biggest challenges of case studies is identifying what people are learning from them. And so what I wanted to do was really just give a little bit of context as I think where case studies fit in the overall learning context. And this will essentially deal with a subject that is very near and dear to my heart, which is the notion of complexity. Now, the problem with complexity is that anytime I talk about complexity, everyone is going to have a different notion of what it is that I am talking about, and every one of those notions will all at once be right and wrong. So what I need to do is not tell you what complexity is, but tell you about the different types of complexity as I see them, so I can be at least clear as to what I am discussing. And I would argue that there are three basic sources of complexity. One is unfamiliarity. And unfamiliarity can be framed as, what is it that we need to know that we don't already know? That is one source of complexity. Another source of complexity is how complicated it is. This is an algorithmic type of complexity that computer scientists and basically, as if we've got a goal, how do we move from where we start to reach that goal? It is the complexity of the underlying approach. In the world of computer science, we used to have expert systems. Then finally, there is complexity associated with deciding as to where you want to go. What should your goal be? How do you figure out what set of activities is going to produce the greatest payback from the environment? So I think it's what do we need to know, where do we want to go, and how do we plan to get there? And each one of them is essentially a separate dimension. I'm just going to talk a little bit more about this. First, we'll talk about unfamiliarity. When a context is unfamiliar, we experience certain things. We can experience it as difficult. How many of you remember what it was like when you were learning to drive? Was it easy or hard when you first got behind the wheel? Very, very hard. How hard is it now when you get behind the wheel? It's easy. Our mind is specifically designed so if we repeat things over and over again, things that start out hard become chunked, they become automated, and we can start doing them with no concentration. Certainly, as I watch people driving, I can see people talking on their cell phone, driving, eating, and applying makeup at the same time. And they only run into me maybe 1 out of 10 times when they're doing it. I've been rear-ended 3 times by people in that category. We also have uncertainty. When something is unfamiliar, we think about it. We don't know. There's information lacking. Whereas when we've repeated something over and over again, we don't have to think about it. Finally, there's ambiguity. You know, is this a woman's face or someone playing the saxophone? We have different alternatives, and depending upon our context, we see them differently and sometimes very differently. These are all things that vanish as we repeat and do something over and over again. So that's one dimension of complexity, and I'll call that experienced complexity. And this is a distinctly human thing. You know, if you ask a computer how difficult something is, the computer is not going to be able to answer you. They might be able to answer in terms of how many cycles it takes, how much memory, and stuff like that. But ultimately, this is a human experience. Now, the next type of complexity is the complexity as it deals with plans and algorithms and so forth. Here we have a map of Manhattan. Here is a corresponding map of roughly the same area in Boston. Which of these is more complicated? The right-hand side or the left-hand side? The right-hand side, Boston. How do you know? Well, actually, I'd say it's because I wrote it right here. But beyond that, yeah, well, I didn't want anyone to get it wrong. Why is it that New York seems less complicated than Boston? Well, in a sense, if you count the number of streets, there are actually more streets on the New York map. However, there is a pattern. So if I needed to tell you to get from any point A or point B, in New York, I could essentially give you two coordinates, X and Y, and there are lots of different paths which would all be the same length that would get you there. On the other hand, if I'm trying to get from point A to point B in Boston, what happens when you ask people directions in Boston? Has anyone here been to Boston, asked people directions? What do they tell you? Good luck, yeah. The best you can hope for, well, is it's over in that general direction. If you drive in that general direction, you'll get there eventually. Why? They may do this same thing every day, but they don't know the names of the streets, and if they walk it, they don't know whether the streets are one way or not. It would take a much larger computer program to store this information than it would to store this information. This one would compress down. There's a concept in computer science, Kolmogorov complexity, which is basically the most you can compress an algorithm and still retain all its information. The idea is that when things are very complicated, there is more information that needs to be stored than when they've got repetitive patterns. Herbert Simon has written a lot on this. Complicated things have large descriptions. Here, for example, is the final page of the Dodd-Frank bill, which was passed in 2011. It's page 2319. Dodd-Frank does not have a single regulation in it. It is a description of the regulations that need to be created. In 2013, they stacked up all the regulations associated with the Affordable Care Act, more than 30,000 pages at that time and still climbing. These are very complicated things because when you have a system, and remember, this is the path, how to get there, the number of rules just keeps growing and growing and growing. I particularly like this thing. This is a marketing diagram from SAP trying to help you identify what version of SAP to buy. Jeepers, I'd just take one look at that and say, okay, I got to get into a different business. So at any rate, the third type of complexity deals with the fitness of the goal that we're trying to achieve. And I call this extrinsic complexity because this is complexity as the environment is going to reward you or not reward you. Now, in a very simple, decomposable world, say the world of a test. If you've got a test with 20 multiple choice questions, are you always better off getting question 17 right versus wrong, all other things being equal? This isn't a hard question. If I gave you a choice, do you want to be right on question 17 or wrong on question 17? What would you choose? Right. Why? Because question 17 contributes to your overall fitness, your overall score on the test, independently of the other questions. Now, let's think about a cookbook. Is garlic a good ingredient? It depends. What does it depend on?
Is it cake or steak?
Yeah, what are you making? That's right. If you're making a dish with lamb, you can hardly ever go wrong by adding garlic. But once you move into the dessert category, it becomes a lot more iffy. Now, there is a restaurant in San Francisco called the Stinking Rose where they add garlic to every single item on the menu. I recommend going next door for desserts. Everything else is pretty cool. And here, fitness is determined by the combination. Individual attributes don't matter, or you can't predict what their impact is going to be without knowing the rest of the things, the rest of the combination. So, for example, if I were to add half a teaspoon of baking powder to a vindaloo curry, chances are nobody would notice, because basically vindaloo burns out your taste buds. My personal favorite. You don't need strong taste buds for that. It'll overwhelm everything. Now, you leave out that half teaspoon of baking powder from a cake recipe, and you're building construction material. So the impact of little changes can be very, very large in a high extrinsic complexity situation, or it can be very small, and it's going to depend entirely on the context. This is the type of complexity which I feel is most appropriate for case studies. So again, the extreme for extrinsic complexity is decomposable, where each attribute contributes, such as the weighted values of questions on a test. They contribute independently of the other attributes. So you can ask a question like, how important was X2 to the overall score? Whereas when they interact, essentially you need to know the value of all the other variables before you can tell what X2's impact is going to be. I remember one of the strangest activities that I had to do when I went up for promotion was I had to rank my percent contribution on every single paper that I had with a co-author. I think if there's a Jeopardy, if you if you were playing Jeopardy and the answer was, what is a number that's always going to add to more than 100%, it would be faculty members' individual contributions to a paper. Because, we all, it's kind of meaningless. I have one paper or a couple of papers where I probably did 95% of the work, but my co-author served to moderate my extreme tendencies, and as a result, it got published in our premier journal. If I hadn't had the co-author, it would not have gotten published in the premier journal. On the other hand, I did most of the work. So what was our respective contribution? It's like the addition of baking powder. If you don't have the right mix of ingredients, you get a product which is going to be judged by the external world as inferior. So, where do cases fit into this domain? Well, let's look at these three dimensions: unfamiliarity, experience complexity; complicated, which is what I call intrinsic complexity. How large is the description required to go about solving the problem? And ruggedness. Because if you were to draw out, and usually I have a diagram of this. Did I put that diagram in the wrong place? Apparently not. I must have gotten rid of it. That's a bummer. If you look at highly complex situations like this, what happens is that if everything contributes here independently, how many peaks are you going to have? What is the peak value you can get on a test? 100%. Every question right. Are there any other 100% peaks? No. Now, if you look at a cookbook, I would argue that every single recipe represents the author's concept of a local peak. Why do I say that? When you create a recipe, what are you trying to do?
Produce a finished
produce a finished product. And if you thought the finished product was better using a half a teaspoon of cinnamon instead of a quarter teaspoon of cinnamon, what would you do? You'd change the recipe. So basically, when the author publishes a recipe, they believe that any incremental change to that recipe is going to produce a result that is less good. That is, by definition, a peak. So if you look at The Joy of Cooking, which has thousands of recipes in it, you're looking at a fitness landscape with thousands of local peaks. That's what interactions does for you. So when you've got something that has a right answer, which is to say low in ruggedness, is not too complicated, and is in a domain where you've got familiarity. Because if you're unfamiliar, remember, it takes a lot of your brain power just to deal with the uncertainty. Then I would argue this is a domain where lecture can be very effective. I remember when I was doing my doctorate, I was asked to take this course at MIT on basically computer systems concepts. And this course basically started out with binary machine language, went to assembly language, went to the C programming language, went to the Unix operating system, and then covered SQL, all in one semester. This was MIT, and but what was interesting was it was a lecture course. And I remember, as I was listening to lectures, I literally could understand every word. I had no formal computer training, but I had 7 years of experience butting my head against programming problems that I didn't know how to solve. And so I was always using unsophisticated sorts and all these things because I'd never had any training. Well, when I listened to this course, it was like, oh, yeah, of course, I can use that algorithm. Oh, hashing. Oh, yeah, that's, I've had that problem so many times. This is so much better way of doing it. And so I could literally listen to the things once and understand them. And believe me, that's not my normal experience with lectures. Normally, it is an opportunity to contemplate life in a dreamlike state. By the way, MIT also did a study where they measured the galvanic skin response of students over the course of an entire week and then aggregated these responses, looking at how their brainwave patterns, because galvanic skin response and brainwaves are quite correlated, how their brainwave patterns varied over the course of the week. And there were two activities that were indistinguishable from death. One was watching TV, and the other was attending lecture. So that's exciting. But at any rate, now, as it gets more complicated, I would argue there's still a right answer, but now we need exercise cases. We need ways to practice what we're doing. But we don't really have decisions. What we just have to do is learn about the right way. Now let's add up where it becomes a little less familiar. Here, lecture may be too abstract for us to initially comprehend it. Here's where example cases fit in nicely. Again, an example case takes you through an example to either a right or a wrong answer, and you conclude that from the example, but it makes things more concrete. The human mind is hardwired to retain stories better than it retains other types of communication. There's a lot of research to show that. So with example cases, you're telling stories. As it gets even more complicated, we need walkthroughs. So basically, there's a lot of areas where either you don't need cases at all or you don't need the type of cases that I've been talking about. Now, as you move to ruggedness, remember, with ruggedness comes multiple peaks. Multiple peaks means that you've got different answers to problems that are local optima. So just like the recipes in the cookbook, you can't get better than them incrementally. And in many cases, you don't have enough information to determine whether that local peak is a very high peak or whether there are other local peaks that could be higher. So that, to a certain extent, is a matter of judgment. The search for local peaks is where discussion cases become very useful. Now, if it's not too complicated and it's a familiar domain, then the discussion cases can be very short. Then we're just investigating whether or not a particular peak, whether or not a particular combination is a peak. As it gets more complicated, the discussion cases get longer. And as we move into the domain of unfamiliarity, we tend to need to provide a lot of context. And that is where the long discussion cases come in. But the key is, if there's a right answer and you want to communicate the right answer, my recommendation is tell people what the right answer is. Don't make them guess. If you've got a lot of possible answers and you don't even really know which of them is the best answer, but you do know that there are lots of valleys between those peaks where you don't want to be under any circumstances, that's where the discussion case becomes a particularly useful tool. And I would argue that that is where a lot of the real world problems that we encounter fall. If the decision maker who's embedded in the context is having a tough time making the decision, then it shouldn't be an easy decision for people sitting in the classroom. If it is an easy decision for people sitting in the classroom, either they don't understand the context or they have information that was not available to the decision maker. Or the decision maker's incompetent. But you know what? I would never write a case study about a decision maker who I considered incompetent, because I think I mentioned in the morning session, we really don't need to train our students on bad decision making. They come in with that knowledge. We don't need to reinforce that. So I would rather have a good decision maker and deal with their types of problems as opposed to portray bad decisions. As I say, they don't need to learn that from us. They'll learn that on the streets. So when you have a short discussion case within Bloom's taxonomy, and this is the old version of Bloom's taxonomy, but the new version basically fits equally well. Essentially, we expect them to come in with the knowledge and understanding of the situation. Here, we're just looking for the analysis, the synthesis, the evaluation of options. When we've got a long discussion case, we expect them to acquire knowledge from the case, develop an understanding through rereading the case, think about how to apply that knowledge, and exercise all these skills. As a result, what the long discussion case does is it puts together a portfolio of all these cognitive skills that have been identified by individuals like Bloom, and that's where its great strength lies. But you don't need a discussion case if you're trying to teach someone how to factor an equation, because there are algorithms for that. There are approaches for that which you can teach, and that's probably going to be more efficient than having them do a long discussion. Okay, so that is my brief input into the cases in learning. The last thing, Cybersecurity Framework PDF. I'll load it from here. Yeah, maybe. Okay, let's see. Cybersecurity case framework. All right, so this is the... how many of you who work in the cybersecurity area are familiar with the NIST framework or have heard about that? Okay, the NIST framework basically divides cybersecurity up into different activities. One involves identifying your vulnerabilities. Another involves protecting yourself from protecting yourself. Another involves detecting intrusions and threats that are coming. Another involves responding to those threats. And finally, we've got one dealing with an overall recovery. How do we recover from the threats? So I taught the cybersecurity case class for the first time this fall to a mixture of undergraduates and graduate students. And basically, we used 7 of the cases that we developed. On the identify side, we used a case involving cyber insurance at USF. This was the University of South Florida was considering whether or not to buy cyber insurance. Well, it turns out the decision to buy cyber insurance is complicated by a number of factors. First off, in the US, cyber insurance policies tend to be very different from other insurance policies. You know, if you buy a home insurance, what happens if your home burns down? What does the insurance company do? They pay you for a home, basically, at least if you've got a good insurance company. If you've got a life insurance policy and you die, what happens? They pay your survivors. You may not be around to see it, but that should be what happens. So when you have a cyber insurance policy, what happens if hackers come in and attack your system? Do they pay you for all the damage the hackers do? Typically, that's not the way these things are structured. Typically, they have a very low policy cap in terms of what they'll pay you for the damages. What they will do is provide you immediate access to expertise, because it turns out if you've got a cybersecurity problem, you can make it much, much worse by not responding properly and immediately, and typically you don't have that expertise in-house. So in a sense, when you buy a cybersecurity policy, it's a little bit more like having someone build a firehouse next to your house, so that if there's a fire, you'll get a very rapid response and you'll limit the amount of damage that's done. Well, if you're going to do that, then you need to go through all your information assets and figure out just how much damage could be done in the event of compromise of each of these information assets. Because, for example, if your grades get out, that can cause all sorts of problems and lawsuits. Employee data, if that escapes, then potentially you can owe up to $15,000 per employee if you do not react in the appropriate way and make the appropriate notifications. So rather than being a policy that produces money for you, it rather is a policy that produces expertise for you. And then you have to weigh off things like, well, what's the value of having that expertise in-house? What's the value of having the insurance company come in and underwrite you? And this is how the insurance companies limit their exposure to damage. The protect case is, how do you protect your assets? And in here, one of the cases we have is JVAB. JVAB is a case study on a company that does red team penetration testing. So basically, if you retain JVAB, they're going to go in and try and hack into your systems and determine your vulnerabilities by actually exploiting them and then alerting you of that. The question that they actually have is, how do we hire people for this? They have a fundamental problem because a lot of their clients are military clients. Military clients cannot retain anyone who has a criminal record. So they can't have anyone with a criminal record. Now, what do you suppose is a distinguishing factor of most hackers who are really good? They've been caught at least once. And as a result, you can't retain them. So where do you go and find the people that you need to do this testing effectively? Jagged Peak is the marketing company I was talking about earlier. They were trying to decide whether or not to implement two-factor authentication and what the implications would be for this business that has essentially provides marketing and logistics sites for small companies all around the world. And it has a lot of sort of interesting implications. Detect. Here what you're doing is you're trying to detect problems. Now, The exposing sexual predators is one that we have not gotten full approval for yet because it's such a sensitive nature. But basically, this is a group that is using cyber forensics to identify sexual predators in the martial arts field. It turns out there's a big problem in martial arts because they're not regulated the way daycare is regulated. But in fact, they're often used the way daycare is used because people send their kids to martial arts class after school so that they've got something to do before they come home. And there have been some significant instances where martial arts instructors have been identified as sexual predators, but they move from state to state and they're not regulated. So as a consequence, it can be very, very difficult to catch and prosecute them. With cyber forensics, you can do a lot to identify individuals who are potentially in this category, but it comes at a cost, because you're running into all sorts of privacy laws and other issues. And so basically this is a project that is dealing with this. And you'll learn a lot about the martial arts in this case as well. I'm really looking forward to publishing it because it's an interesting case. Dynamic logic is a case that I came up with as a result of a presentation here. For those of you who have been at the conference many times, Dr. Leonid Perlovsky often presents on this tool, Dynamic Logic, which is basically a tool that allows you to detect patterns in data that looks nearly random or has lots and lots of noise. And in the defense industry, this algorithm is used, for example, in radar systems to help identify objects in a very, very fuzzy screen. Well, he took a database that was basically provided as a test database by, I can't remember what agency it was, and he ran his algorithm on it, and it beautifully identified, I think it was 17 different types of malware. In fact, it identified every type of malware, except it didn't know what it was identifying. It simply said that these observations have a certain pattern in common, and it did it very, very fast. Well, there are a lot of potential applications for this in the world of cybersecurity in terms of network detecting penetration. The problem is that he has very little interest in cybersecurity. His interest is looking at the effect of music on the brain. I mean, that literally is what he's studying, even though he's a physicist by training. So the question is, how does he move forward with this? How does, or does it just get abandoned? I actually got a collaborator, because this was a rather technical case, someone who was also here in this conference from Brazil, who was working on his cybersecurity master's program and was really fascinated by this. And so I got him to help me write the case because it was a little bit beyond my domain. We actually have two ReliaQuest cases. ReliaQuest is a security company, and it is, the first case deals with the question of whether or not to further negotiate with a client, a potential client who wants 100% protection against cybersecurity. That was one of the questions that we ran through. The second case is really interesting because they had a client whose, some of whose systems were compromised by ransomware, and basically the ransom had to be paid in bitcoins, but the client did not want the word to get out that they had been attacked, and so they asked ReliaQuest to act as an intermediary and deal with the hackers and get the bitcoins. One of the things that I learned in this case that I never knew is there's actually a Bitcoin ATM in Tampa, but it'll only allow you to get something like $10,000 worth of bitcoins at a time. So they're bringing all sorts of employees over to put cash into this machine to get the bitcoins to potentially pay the ransom. But there are a lot of other concerns there, because do you really want to pay a ransom to these folks? What are the implications if ReliaQuest gets involved in this? How much do you owe to your client? And basically, this was not a compromise that could in any way be attributed to ReliaQuest. This was something the client themselves did that was very dumb. But what are the implications for your business? So it was a really interesting case, and and this case was actually written by students of Matt Malarkey. Finally, recovery. After my personal website was hacked for the 6th time, my internet service provider took it down when all of a sudden they managed to hack it in a way that suddenly all the links in my website pointed to a PayPal phishing scheme. The problem is nobody could figure out what was causing the hack, because I wasn't doing anything that terribly sophisticated on the website. But then the question is, okay, what do I do? Do I just abandon the site? And I actually have left the site down for a while so I could keep this case. So if you go to Grandon.com, it'll say, hey, I've been hacked and I'm trying to decide what to do about it. And that's all it says right now. But the question is, how important is it to me to rebuild the site? If I do, what architectures do I need to take? How can I prevent this from happening again? Because this has been a waste of time, and I don't really need a vanity site. But on the other hand, at times in the past, it has been a very useful site for me. For example, when our Doctorate of Business Administration program was unofficially approved, it was going to be 4 months before it was officially approved, and we were not allowed to talk about it officially. So I used my Grandon.com site to talk about it unofficially, and I developed all sorts of videos and stuff. And a lot of the individuals who joined our inaugural cohort actually did so as a result of that site. So at any rate, those are the cases that basically go through this whole framework. I'm just about out of time. Indeed, I am out of time. So let me just part by saying all of these cases, except for the sexual predators one, are available right here. So just to give you an idea of what the case looks like, this is the JVAB hiring case. If you come at, this was actually a short one, it was only 14 pages, but the case is going to look like this. It's got background on the company, on its activities, on its operations, the recruiting challenge, and so forth. And it's got some exhibits like the ACM Code of Ethics, I guess, and a document from within the company. And every case is like that. All of these cases are completely open access, and so you're welcome to use them, share them, ask me questions about them. And there are some additional cases here as well. I only had room for 7 cases in the first course just because of the way the course was structured. With that, that's pretty much all I've got to say. I don't want to eat into the time of the next presentation, which starts at 2. So if there are any questions, however, I'm delighted to answer them during the break. And thank you very much. I hope you found this to be a useful session. Thank you.